In the last lectures, you learned how to use canActivate to control access to a route. Now I want to focus on the control of whether you are allowed to leave a route or not. We can control this too, and we might want to control this if we are logged in once we do edit a server. Now we, for example, are allowed to edit the dev server, and here, if we actually changed something, I want to ask the user if he accidentally clicks back or somewhere else, if you really want to leave, or if you maybe forgot to click update server first. So this convenience method of keeping the user from accidentally navigating away. How can we implement this? Let's go to the edit server component for this, here, and let's add a new property. Below allow edit, I'll add a changes saved property, which is false by default, and which I want to change whenever we click on update server. Here, of course, we did update the server, so I want to call changes saved and set this to true here, because now the changes were indeed saved. After the changes were saved here, I want to navigate away. So I will inject the router here of type router, make sure to add the import at the top as always from the @Angular router package. And then here, after we saved our changes, I want to navigate away. I want to go up one level to the last loaded server. And for this, I will pass the relative to configuration and want to navigate relative to the currently active route. So far, so good. We're changing this changes saved property here. Now let's make sure that whenever the user tries to accidentally navigate away, that we prevent him from doing so, or at least ask if he really wants to leave. Now we somehow need to execute this code in this component here, because we will need access to this changes saved method, which informs us on whether this update button was clicked or not. However, a guard always needs to be a service, because we need to provide it just like we provided the off guard. So somehow this doesn't fit. We need to access the code in our component and have a service, and that sounds like a complicated setup, but it isn't. It's actually really simple. In my edit server folder here, I'll add a new file. I'll name it canDeactivate guard, and this again will also be a service, as all guards are. And in here, I first of all now want to export an interface. An interface simply is a contract which can be imported by some other class, let's say, which forces this class to provide some logic. So here I will name this can component deactivate, and this interface will require one thing from the component which implements it. This component should have a can deactivate method. This method, and this is simply how I define the type of this can deactivate method, since this is only an interface, it won't contain the actual logic, it will only contain the information how it should look like. So this method should take no arguments, but in the end it should return an observable, which therefore needs to be imported in this file here from rxjs observable, which will resolve to a boolean in the end, or a promise, which will resolve to a boolean in the end, or just a boolean. You might recognize this pattern here from the canActivate guard. These guards share the same structure. So that is my interface. Nice to have it, but that alone won't do the trick. Now let's come to the important thing, the meat of this class, of the service here I should say, the service itself. So I'll name it canDeactivate guard, and this guard will implement canDeactivate. This is an interface provided by the Angular router, so we need to import it from there. This actually is a generic type, and it will wrap our own interface. So it will wrap an interface which forces some component or some class to implement the canDeactivate method. Might sound complicated, but this is the setup which will make sure that we later can easily connect a component to our canDeactivate guard here. So for now, let's just go with that piece of information. And now this class here, this guard, we'll also need to have a can deactivate method. This is the can deactivate method which will be called by the Angular router once we try to leave a route. Therefore, this will have the component on which we're currently on as an argument, and this component needs to be of type can component deactivate, which means it needs to be a component which has this interface here implemented, therefore a component which has a can deactivate method. This will become super important in a second. We also will receive the current route as an argument, so that is an activated route snapshot. Need to make sure to import this too. It will have the current state, so that is a router state snapshot, import this too. And the next state, so where do you want to go? Because remember, this will be called at the end when we want to leave a route. So next state is an optional argument though. This will also be a router state snapshot. And this will now also return an observable, a promise, or a boolean. So just like the can activate guard. That is how the can deactivate method in our can deactivate guard looks like. And here I now want to call can deactivate on the component we're currently on. And this is why I need to implement this interface in this component, why I created this interface in the first place, because now the Angular router can execute can deactivate in our service and can rely on the fact that the component we're currently on has the can deactivate method too, because this is where we will actually implement the logic checking whether we are allowed to leave or not, because we need this connection between our guard and the component. So this is why we can safely call can deactivate here. And now with that information, we can go back to our app routing module. And on the edit page here, we want to add this guard. So we can add can deactivate as a property to this route config. It takes an array just like can activate. And here we now will point to our can deactivate guard. Make sure to add this import therefore. And now Angular will run this guard whenever we try to leave this path here, this component loaded at this path. For this to work, we of course need to go to our module and provide our can deactivate guard, just like before, can deactivate. With this provided, make sure to add the import. We're almost there, but one important piece is missing. Remember that I told you that the can deactivate guard will in the end call can deactivate in our component? Well, for this to work on our added server component, here we need to implement our can component deactivate interface, our own interface we exported in our can deactivate guard service file, this interface. This interface now forces us to implement the can deactivate method in our component, which is important because we try to call this method on our component here. So in the added server component here, I will simply add a can deactivate method now. We know how this method should look like because we defined it here. It should return an observable, a promise, or a boolean. So let's make sure that it does. And now here, first of all, we need to import observable from rxjs/observable. But with that added, with this import added, here in can deactivate, we now provide the actual logic deciding on whether we are allowed to leave or not. This logic will be run whenever the can deactivate guard is checked by the Angular router. So here I will quickly check if we're first of all allowed to edit this, because if we're not allowed like this, here I will return true anyways, because hey, we weren't allowed to edit it in the first place, so sure, you may leave. And otherwise, I will check if my server name here is unlike the server name we had at the beginning. Server name here, this property, is simply bound via two-way binding to user inputs. So initially it is set to the value we get from outside, from the server which was loaded. We bind it here. But as soon as we type, we will have some differences. So if we have differences on the server name or on the server status, so here I also check if this is not the same as before, server status. So if one of the two was changed, and now I will wrap it in parentheses. So if one of the two was changed and the changes were not saved, so changes saved is false. In this case, I want to return a confirm dialog where I ask the user, do you want to discard the changes? Otherwise, I will return true because otherwise either nothing was changed or it was changed, but changes saved is set to true, so we did save it indeed. With this in place, let's go back to our servers and first of all log in maybe. Let's go to the dev server, which is the one we are allowed to edit. And here, if I now type something there and I didn't click update server and I click somewhere else, we are asked if we want to leave. And if I click cancel, we stay on this page. We may now save our changes and then we are navigated away without getting any issues at all. And the fact that we updated the wrong server simply happens because here we still are always loading the server with the ID 1. So we should update this to get our real ID. So maybe here, access our route, snapshot, params ID, and pass this as an ID. And thereafter, of course, also subscribe to route params to update the ID if params change. That is something you can do as an exercise. And of course, make this of type number by converting it. But more importantly here, everything's working as it should. We are only allowed to change this if we did click update, otherwise we are asked. Or of course, if here once we are asked, we click OK, we are allowed to discard our changes. So that is true, or that is possible too. But now with can deactivate, we have this extra protection in place. So with this, we learned a lot about routing in this module. Now there's one more guard I want to dive into, and we will do so in the next lecture.